We're all very human and fallible, and yet we live in a society that rewards pretending we're not fallible, or the range of acceptable fallibility is narrow.
We are constantly comparing our insides to other people's outsides and feeling inadequate and guilty, even ashamed.
Trying to blend in means parts of ourselves must disappear, and we must then live in fear that we will be found out.
Here, together, we will create a space where we can laugh, cry, and carry our suffering and hurts lightly.
In the service of being deeply human.
This is Life's Dirty Little Secrets.
Welcome to Life's Dirty Little Secrets. I'm Emma Waddington.
And I'm Chris McCurry. Today we are privileged to have as our guest Dr. Amy Beddows. She has her Ph.D. from London Metropolitan University, doing her research into the experience of victim blame within her work at the university's Child and Women Abuse Unit. She's a student counselor at Edinburgh Napier University. Dr. Beddows offers training and consultancy sessions to professionals who want to create a trauma-sensitive space for survivors of rape and sexual assault. She is also a fan of horror movies and is particularly interested in the psychology behind rape revenge flicks. So welcome, Dr. Beddows.
Thank you so much.
Victim blame. This is a hot topic. How did you get into it?
Yeah, unfortunately, it is still very much current. And I did my PhD over 6 years part-time. And when I started, I had a bit of a concern. What if by the time I get to the end of my research, it's been solved and it's not a problem? And unfortunately, that is still not an issue. It is still very apparent. And it came to me really that it was something worth exploring. I spent a few years working in America as a victim advocate. So the kind of equivalent in the UK, we have independent sexual violence advocates, ISVAs. And I did that role for a couple of years. And it really, what I saw was that survivors of sexual violence, they tell us that they often feel judged or blamed for what's happened to them, for what's been done to them. But this wasn't always a very clear communication in terms of somebody said this to them or someone's treating them in a very judgmental way. And there was really subtle things that they were experiencing from, could be police officers, nurses, family, friends, social workers, that just made them feel like they were being seen as responsible for what they'd been through. And some of this was like body language, but also the kind of processes that they had to go through to get support or to report what happened to them. And it got me thinking really that when we talk about victim blame in the sort of therapeutic field, we do really specify comments, someone saying, oh, well, you shouldn't have been drinking, or you shouldn't have gone out to that place, or you should have told someone, or you shouldn't have done that. It's all focused on what the victim has been doing or was or is or wasn't. And yet actually there's an awful lot of blame that's communicated non-verbally. And I think that's what I was really interested in, and in what women, particularly who've experienced sexual violence, what they saw as blaming from others. So that's really what started my research. And it took a while, but it was really interesting. The outcomes were not what I expected at all, to be honest.
And I guess it's really uncomfortable, isn't it, to think that victims who experience rape or sexual violence of any kind, or any violence really, end up in a situation where they feel responsible. It feels really wrong. Feels really wrong that happens. And yet it is so common for those of us who work in the field and work with trauma and, victims of abuse. They do internalize a lot of the responsibility. And it's heartbreaking to think that not only does it come from their own narrative, but it also comes from the narrative of the people that surround them. It's hard. It's hard to hear that, really.
It is. And I think we often, any kind of research or literature trying to understand victim blame often talks about the processes behind it. And I think there are very similar processes that go on in terms of why we might internally feel that something's our fault versus why we might feel blaming or judgmental or putting responsibility on others. I think that it's quite a self-protective cognitive mechanism. And I think we touched on this when we were speaking before recording, but the idea of it can be quite a big thing to go through something so traumatic and so awful as sexual violence and have to kind of contend with, oh, maybe the world is actually a really dangerous place and maybe people are not safe and maybe I can't take for granted that I can do these things and live in the world and be safe. That's quite chaotic and quite frightening. So I think it makes sense that perhaps some of us would go, if only I hadn't done this, or if only I wasn't that, it wouldn't have happened. So now I have a bit of a pathway to be safe moving forward. I just won't do those things, or I'll try not to be this person, or I'll try to avoid these situations, which is really sad on two counts, because at first it's really restrictive. It means people stop living sections of their lives or stop being parts of who they are, but also it's not true. We know that the behavior of victims does not cause sexual violence. It's the behavior of offenders and perpetrators. And I think that's one of the sort of the sad things about that fallacy, that it isn't even that protective. And as you hinted at, if we're blaming ourselves for something awful that's happened, it's not going to help us feel better, rebuild our lives, move forward. It's going to internalize a lot of shame, maybe guilt. It's going to affect our self-esteem. It can affect relationships with others. The impacts are huge. And that's on top of the impacts of having experienced sexual violence or trauma in the first place. So it really is such a cruel process. But then I think the process that perhaps other people go through, if they're finding that they're feeling blame, or they're having kind of those sorts of attitudes towards victims, it's about protecting themselves from thinking, well, I wouldn't be a victim. I can't be a victim because I wouldn't do X, Y, and Z. Or I wouldn't put myself in that position, or I'm not that kind of person. So there's a distancing there. Mm-hmm. And again, that happens at a time when a victim is perhaps already feeling quite disconnected, socially isolated. So as you say, it really is incredibly unfair. Mm-hmm. There's a layer on top of the trauma already experienced.
It's so interesting thinking about that added layer, right? That this is an individual who's experienced something horrendous, and yet they are encountering the resistance from everybody else, that nobody really wants to imagine what it was like to be a victim, or to think that one can really be a victim of something so atrocious, because we all hope that the world isn't like that. And so you're absolutely right. This attempt to protect our own ego or our sense of safety in the world is to blame the victim. And absolutely, the victim must feel that sense of isolation, because in a way, they then get ostracized, excluded mm-hmm. of what they represent, which is this risk. Others don't want to hear about what happened because that makes me feel scared and worried about my safety.
Absolutely. And it's the interesting thing about victim blame is when we talk about it, we tend to think of sexual violence or violent crimes, but it is something we do in lots of other circles. So, as an example, someone tells you they had their car stolen, you might think, oh, that's awful, I'm so sorry. But you might also think, oh, where did you park? Did you lock it? Did you leave something on, did you leave your iPhone on the seat? Oh, was it a lit area? Was it a secure car park? You might go through all those things. And I think partly that's to go, okay, well, I would never park there. I would never leave my car unlocked. It won't happen to me. So there is a bit, as you say, that safety checking. But of course, when it's that someone's been through something as awful as sexual violence, the impact of that is so much more distressing. I mean, it's bad enough, I think, if you've had your car stolen and people are making you feel like you shouldn't have parked it wherever you left it. So, but yeah, with trauma, it's a whole other level that just, if people are already feeling their trust in others is fractured, or that they've been devalued by the person who's attacked them, victim blame just really amplifies all of that emotionally and cognitively, I think, for people.
So you mentioned that you were surprised by some of the results from your research. Can you tell us what was surprising, what you hadn't expected?
Yeah, of course. Because I went into my PhD with my background in therapy, and specifically cognitive behavior therapy was kind of my main approach, which really tries to understand people's difficulties or experiences from thought processes and behaviors and feelings in very distinct kind of categories. And I kind of had this idea in my head that my research would show really distinct categories of how victim blame's communicated. Oh, it's when people say this or do this or act like this or don't do this. And I thought it would be really neat, and therefore would be a lovely, easy thing to formulate and then tackle, to be able to say to professionals, just do this, this, and this, and don't do this, this, and this. And it wasn't that at all. The main thing I found was that very few of the women I met with, so my research involved running focus groups with women who'd experienced sexual violence. Very few of them had actually felt directly blamed for what had happened to them. It feels like that's the whole point of victim blame. That's kind of what it is. But more of them had felt blamed for other things. So how they were coping with the violence after it happened. They said they felt blamed for how they reported to police. You didn't do it soon enough. You did it too soon. You didn't do it in the right way. You didn't speak to the right people. You haven't been to your doctor. You haven't talked about therapy, or you haven't taken the medication, or anything and everything. There was blame, not just around the fact they'd been a victim. And a lot of the women I met with said that they felt it was more to do with the fact they were women, or that they were Black women, or that they were women with a disability, or that they were older women. They felt that's what they were being kind of blamed or judged for, more than the fact they'd experienced sexual violence. And that completely turned the whole thing on its head then, because as we're saying, a lot of the typical understandings of victim blame is that it's this defense mechanism against ourselves feeling vulnerable. We don't want to feel like we could be a victim. But this suggests that not only is it that, but it's so deeply interlinked in sexism, racism, ableism, all these other prejudices, that if the person or the service, because some of these blaming experiences were very much from an agency, not just an individual, that the kind of response was really levied at anything it could see in the victim's identity. Because in some cases, there was nothing. It's very hard to blame a woman who was abused as a child. I mean, sometimes organizations do find ways to do this, but, to say you're a child, this person was an adult, how on earth could they be culpable? But then actually they found other ways of saying it. Well, why didn't you tell someone sooner? Or why didn't you tell your teachers? Or why have you learned to use alcohol to cope with these feelings? That's not good. You should do something healthy, like going to a therapist or using art. So it was this noise around the victimization was where the blame was really sitting. And that makes it much harder to intervene, because suddenly we're looking at just women blaming, or Black women blaming, or women with autism blaming. It became a much bigger thing. And my CBT brain really didn't like that, because I was thinking, well, how on earth can I put this in neat boxes that make sense? I couldn't. And I guess that's the problem. It's such a big, nebulous issue that actually is really hard to pin it down. And yet a lot of the research and a lot of the stuff written on it says it's just people blaming victims for having experienced violence. And it's not. It's so much bigger and more insidious than that.
I would imagine that if there's a significant difference between, say, the background of the person working in a sexual assault clinic and the survivor walking in the door, that there might be some sort of disconnect. If we don't have enough, people of color and people with disabilities, and even, people on the autism spectrum working in these clinics and such, I could see why this disconnect and this lack of empathy, or at least minimizing of it, would happen.
It's a really good point, and I think we've touched on it in our previous conversation on good and evil, this sort of tendency of us humans to, want to think in dichotomies and to be quite tribalistic, right? And to empathize with those that are in our group and not with those that are out of our group, and how quickly we include and exclude people. And yeah, just any feature of an individual makes them different. They're out, especially if a victim.
I think there's definitely an element of that. And again, a lot of the research, there was an awful lot done around victim blame, particularly in the 90s and early 2000s. It did sort of talk about that in-group, out-group difference, that perhaps if we see someone as being different to ourselves, we're more likely to blame rather than have that empathy. But then the interesting flip side as well is there's some research that suggests the more we relate to someone, the more likely we are to blame them as well, because we think, oh, well, if it could happen to them, it could happen to me. I must very quickly find a reason that it happened to them that it won't happen to me. So for example, well, I wouldn't drink that much, or I wouldn't dress that way, or I wouldn't go here. So it's interesting that both, I think, come into play. And that means we kind of end up blaming everyone potentially, because we either relate to them or we don't. And that's why I think there's so many different social processes going on. And victim blame is kind of a useful shorthand to call out what's happening, particularly within agencies and services that should do better. But it's not capturing the whole picture, because, it's so. A lot of the women I spoke to, they talked about this constant catch-22, that they felt, however I engage with an agency, however I talk about what's happened to me, or if I don't talk about it, I can be blamed. I'm at fault.
Yeah.
There's no win, which I thought was really interesting as well. There isn't a way to be a perfect victim.
It speaks to how powerful that urge or that need to blame can be. It's like, it's going to happen. So what do we do?
That's right. It's going to happen. I mean, it's incredible to think that people who choose to work in these environments, such as in an agency or I was going to say in the police force, but maybe that's a different conversation. But in agencies that sort of look after, victims of different types of abuse, etc., could find themselves in this situation
It is, and it's disheartening. I think that's one of the reasons in my research I wanted to focus on women's experiences with engaging with agencies, because we know that friends and families and partners can struggle to treat the people in their lives who've been through something like sexual violence with respect and understanding. And part of that might just be, I don't know, I don't understand this, I don't know how to make sense of it. Whereas you think professionals working in this field would have that knowledge and that understanding. But again, there's an awful lot of research trying to look at why people blame and what can stop people from doing that. And it's often been linked to things like burnout, cynicism, feeling overstretched, which you can understand from all those services. You know, the waiting lists, and in the UK at the moment, it's sort of 2 to 3 years. If you report sexual violence to police, it can take up to 3 years for it to actually get into a courtroom, if it gets there at all. And so the length of time, the weight, the resources that go into it, services, particularly since COVID, are hugely overstretched. Not that that's an excuse, but some people have suggested that's part of the reasoning behind it. But to be more cynical as well, I think sometimes it's all down to how services are structured and how people operate. And one of the things that I found really hard with this research, working as a therapist, was hearing people talk about things in therapy that had felt really negative and really blaming, and thinking, oh my gosh, we do that. Hadn't even thought of that. So an example was women said, you know, when you get the courage to go and you talk to someone and you tell them this happened to me, and then the person you've met with says, great, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to put you on a waiting list. And as soon as we can see you, we'll see you. And that could be months. So someone might have gone for that initial kind of assessment appointment and then waits months to see someone. And again, in the UK with our specialist rape crisis centres, it can be 1 to 2 years for specialist trauma-focused support and counselling, because they're doing the best they can and they're stretched and their waiting lists are huge. But for a survivor, for a victim or a survivor who's been brave enough to take that step, being put on a waiting list feels like you've been told, you don't matter, we'll get to you when we get there, it's not that important. And of course, that's not what we as practitioners are saying, but that's what we're communicating without realising. And the thing that was hopeful, you know, you asked about what we can do about it, was the women also described really small changes that actually could make a difference, could challenge those messages. So for example, with waiting lists, one of the women I met with, she spoke about, it was her local rape crisis centre, and they said to her, look, the waiting list is really long and we're really sorry, but we can offer you a weekly phone check-in. You can come to our coffee morning. We can offer you texts, just checking in how you are while you're waiting. And that made such a difference, because it told her that somebody cared, that she wasn't forgotten, that they knew the waiting list wasn't ideal and they were doing everything they could to manage it. And that didn't feel blaming. That felt the opposite. That felt respectful, and that she was valued, and that her experiences of trauma mattered. And okay, there is a resource requirement there. There needs to be someone who can make those calls and do those check-ins and offer that. But actually that was, in terms of cost for a service, that was a pretty small intervention that made such a difference. So that's the hopeful bit that came out of this, is if services are willing to really look at and really analyse critically why they're doing things the way they are. And an awful lot of services, you'll know this, I'm sure any of us who've worked in therapy or healthcare, there's a lot of it, well, this is how it's always been done. Or we need this data or this information for our insurance or for our risk assessment. And we don't always have those conversations about, but if we were looking from a client perspective, can we do it differently? Can we make steps shorter? Can we offer other things? Can we be more flexible? And I think that's where we can really start to challenge some of those messages, not just from services, but actually that people are getting from the wider world as well. Because as you say, it's family and friends, it's the media. Coverage of violence is very blaming. It's kind of in popular culture, a lot of media, TV, film. It's everywhere, really. These messages that somehow it's a victim's behavior that results in sexual violence.
And I guess the bottom line is that, I mean, thinking about the services, that makes just listening to you and thinking about it, a client or a victim who finds the courage to go and talk about her or his experience and what it takes to take that first step, to then be told that they'll be put in a waiting list and not know how long that'll be. It's just gut-wrenching to hear that. And to instead be received with an acknowledgement that this is unfair and hard, that you can't see someone immediately, but that we care about you and we will be thinking of you and that you matter. You know, what a change in experience. And absolutely, that's the way it should really be. So it sounds like the piece around services and burnout is potentially a big factor. And it's not the same as people sort of friends and family that are potentially struggling with it in different ways? Do you think that really within services, it's about stress and burnout and overwhelm? And I mean, we talk about it, I don't think enough in our community of secondary trauma. I think listening to, clients who've experienced horrendous trauma is traumatic in itself. Not the same, obviously, degree, but it does impact us. It does, I've seen it in hospitals. People become really hardened by it day in, day out. Yes, of course, there isn't enough people out there to be able to support the therapists and the clinicians that are being faced with this as well. But that secondary trauma is real and it's hard. So I think that is probably a piece of this victim blame too, without, undermining the importance of treating victims with the respect and support they deserve. The reality is that there needs to be care for the victim, the people who look after the victims, and care for them too, because it is hard there too, not to the same degree, but it is tough working in those organizations and with that community. It's hard to be exposed to that every day.
Absolutely. I think you're right. That's such a big part of it. And one of the things I was really mindful of trying to do with my research and what I'm hoping to do with the research after was to not end up blaming the blamers, because it would be really easy to get into that, right? It's people need to be kinder or more compassionate. And I think some of the examples that the women shared with me, that was definitely the case. There were things that were done and said where you think that person should not have been, whatever's going on in their world, that's not acceptable. But I think there is a huge amount of that burnout and that cynicism. I've worked briefly with the police, and I think you see that. There are amazing officers who are working so hard, are so victim supportive, victim centered, and then they see a case get stopped at CPS, or they see something get dismissed, or even if it gets through to conviction, which in the UK is really rare. I think it's something like 1.7% of reported rapes end up actually resulting in a conviction, which there was a report that came out a couple of years ago saying, well, we've basically decriminalized this as an offense because the chance of getting convicted is so low. The message that sends to abusers is go for it. The likelihood of you being held accountable is really low. Whereas, of course, victims are then held accountable because they have to go through that process. They have to go through the re-traumatization and they have to go through all the expectation, and then they don't get any kind of sense of justice. But of course, the police officers or the barristers or the counsellors, the ISVAs, all these people that are on that journey with them, the ones that really care and are really trying to support them, they go through that as well. And they come to that unsatisfying conclusion, and then they have to go back to work the next day and start it again or support other victims. And that must be harrowing to do if what's already a stressful job. So I was very mindful that we need to understand what's happening in a way that doesn't just demonize other people, but also challenge it. Because the main thing and at risk of taking the conversation somewhere else is one of the big things victim blame does is it completely removes accountability from abusers. Because if we're focusing on the victims and then we're focusing on the services that are failing them, who's missing in the picture? It's the people who are committing sexual offences. And so they're not even really, let alone made responsible, they're not even then made culpable for it or having to face any accountability. And that's obviously the other side of this that we really need to address.
It's so interesting. I'm just remembering the conversation we had with Stephen Batchelor and this need that we just as humans, we think in this very black and white way, right? There's the good and there's the evil, and we need to figure out who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. And then we split it. And actually how much is lost when we think in these ways. And instead he talks about opening ourselves up to holding both together. And like you're saying, right? The people who are involved in these services probably go into it for the right reasons, and then bad things happen to them. And, they want good, and yet there's a lot of hardship in it, which means they end up doing things that aren't the way they want them, or they don't turn out the way they want. And that's really hard. So instead of blaming them, just like you said, it's about understanding those two parts, the good that these individuals want to do and how hard it is for them not to be able to carry it out, and how do we support them more? I mean, it's a never-ending question, isn't it? How do we support those, our services so that they have more resources to be able to support our communities, especially these really complex and vulnerable?
So why is Why isn't this more of a societal priority? And what's getting in the way of funding services and streamlining processes? And did your research or what you've learned from other researchers shed any light on that?
Again, I think it's a couple of things, and I'm mindful to try and keep my cynicism in check because I have a sort of a different answer in my head maybe than the one I'm hoping to give. But
Just go right ahead. You're in good company here.
My cynical response is that there is actually a real function of sexual violence and then blaming victims of sexual violence in terms of maintaining the status quo, which is a very patriarchal society in line with gender order. And not just gender, the sort of, the top of the patriarchal tree is the sort of white, middle class, cis, heterosexual male. And I think if we are, as a society, to start really reckoning with sexual violence and domestic violence, other types of gendered violence or culturally specific gendered violence as well, that can require a lot of dismantling because the system isn't working, because it is such a common, prevalent, awful thing, whether it's children, whether it's women, male victims as well. I think that's a hugely underreported problem that because of all the barriers for men who've experienced sexual violence to seek support. So the system is kind of invested in making this seem like it's a one-off, it's an anomaly, it hardly ever happens. If it does happen, it's not that bad. And if it does happen and it is that bad, it was probably the victim's fault. So we don't need to change the system. We just need to educate victims and specifically women. And particularly in the UK, we've seen this. I think there's movement coming, but it's very slow. Like police campaigns around sexual violence are always aimed at women. Don't drink too much on a night out. Make sure you get a licensed taxi home. Did you leave any of your friends behind? It's all women, change your behavior. You rarely see or hear a campaign that says, men, what are you doing? What's happening? Don't, I saw someone on Twitter say it's very telling that if you go into women's toilets in a nightclub, it's often a poster there along those lines. If you go into a men's toilets, it's usually a condom machine. You think those messages that's just sending to people on a night out, having fun, I think that in itself is part of the problem. A less cynical view, I think, unfortunately, there are so many big, deep social issues that are rooted in inequality. Sexual violence and domestic violence is one area that gets one piece of the very small funding pie and is often seen as something people don't want to talk about. And I find that interesting, when you see prominent people go, I support this charity, I lobby this cause. I think the people that do speak up for sexual violence and victims and survivors, they're a very particular mouthpiece and they're often people who've experienced it themselves, and that's brilliant. But there isn't enough of that. I think it still has that icky, we don't really want to talk about it, we don't really want to think about it. And unfortunately, you do get caught up very quickly in these conversations around not all men, which is an important thing to say. And I think since Me Too, there's been a lot of those conversations around, let's really champion male allies and make it really clear that this isn't something we say all men are capable of or all men would do. But I think those conversations are often derailed by the whataboutery, as people would say, but what about male victims? What about this? What about that? And that's all important, but it means we just end up becoming circular in our conversations and never get to an action point. So I think there's a lot going on. And generally, I think it's invested in, we don't really want to change anything because that would really complicate who's in power, who is setting the agenda for how society is made up, who gets the biggest piece of the pie and who doesn't. It's really wrapped up in that sort of neoliberalistic as well, that, individuals are responsible for themselves and the state shouldn't really have to look after and nanny people in that rhetoric. So there's a lot going on at different layers that make it quite hard to get your head around, I think, as well as an issue.
Wow. Yeah. So you've hit something in me that I've thought about recently. And actually, we're going to be doing a talk at some point on gender identity. One of the things that I've been thinking about just with this sort of topic around women's safety is that women do intrinsically feel unsafe, and they have done forever. And the message has been always, do what you can to keep yourself safe because you are unsafe. And it's always struck me that we don't see men taking to the streets to say this should stop. Men shouldn't be violent with women. And I've always wondered why that is, because there's lots of good men in this world. Why is it so hard for men to stand up to other men. And if I speak to men, they'll often go, but we do all the time. We do all the time, but not as a community. And I'm curious about that. I mean, maybe that's not what it takes, but your analogy of the bathroom is so powerful, right? You're absolutely right. I remember those posters. You don't have them in Singapore, but I remember those posters in the Union, in the bars in London, saying, be careful, be careful, be careful. Don't go in an unlicensed car. Can't remember, but lots of messages of danger, danger. You're at risk. You're at risk and you can do something about it. Versus the messages for the men. I don't know what the answer is, and I don't know what it would take for women to start to feel safer in this world. But it is very sad that women continue to feel very unsafe and very vulnerable. And yeah, part of what you've said is that really should change. We should not fear for and I guess we're always going to be vulnerable because we're physically weaker, mostly, not always, as my daughter likes to say. But ultimately, we are physically weaker. But yeah, what would it take to change our sense of safety in the world? And I think part of the victim blame is because it is incredibly uncomfortable to feel unsafe. And it's the reality is that we do always feel unsafe. And when we've spoken to men, I don't think men will ever understand that fully. And I've had many conversations with my husband, and he doesn't agree. He says, actually, just recently we had a conversation and he said, no, your sons in London as teenage boys will feel just as unsafe, if not more, because obviously there's violence in, male adolescents are violent. So they will feel unsafe too. So it is a good point that men do feel unsafe in the hands of other men, not usually in the hands of other women.
That is a really important point, I think, exactly as you say, and it's that differentiation. A phrase I read from an academic called Pamela Foer. It's back from the 70s, and I use it all the time. She talks about sexual violence has a special wrongness. And I think there's something in that as well, that of course young men are vulnerable. I think they are the highest group demographically of people who experience violence. And that is awful and something that needs to be really acknowledged and addressed. But it's very, very different. I think the threat of experiencing physical violence, being beaten up, being attacked, being mugged is very different to sexual violence because it hits on so many different aspects of our identity as women. As a heterosexual woman, as a gay woman, it means so much. It's wrapped up in so much more that, not to say one's more damaging than the other, but it's really different. And I think if every woman who experienced sexual violence went to hospital with a black eye or a knife wound or a broken arm, there's something very visible and tangible that people would go, oh my gosh, okay. And it isn't. And this is where, again, it's a bigger conversation, but there's this concept of rape myths, these sorts of very stereotypical attitudes about rape and victims and perpetrators, which is sort of just so ingrained in everything. And I think some of them really come into play with this, that, sexual violence is caused by a very few, very unwell or very evil, to use that kind of binary dichotomy, men. So even if you had posters in men's toilets saying, don't be a perpetrator, don't be a rapist, most men would look at that and go, well, that's not me. I'm not Hannibal Lecter. I'm not an evil, crazy, unhinged person. I'm a regular guy. That isn't related to me because that's the myth and that's the stereotype. Whereas we know actually rape is very complex. Sexual violence is much more complicated than that. It isn't the stranger and the dirty Mac in the alleyway. It is partners and brothers and friends and sons. It's the people in our homes and our communities. So I think the way we talk about it is just, it doesn't help anyone because, as you say, there are so many men out there who are championing, who want to be allies, who are doing the work, but are fighting against such a difficult tide of that's not what it is. And I think that's why you often hear in these conversations men getting worried about false accusations. And false allegations is always mentioned, even though time and time again, research has shown you are far more likely to be wrongly accused of stealing something or of physical violence than you are of sexual violence. And actually for men are much more likely to be a victim of sexual violence than to be falsely accused of committing sexual violence. But that doesn't translate into what people fear. And I think that's all about the messaging, culture, and the media. Media really plays into this with how they report on cases, how they talk about certain crimes. Even you mentioned young men, say, in London feeling unsafe. living in the UK, the predominant image that comes to my mind when I think of that is black men and knife crime. And that's so reductive and that's so specific, and it makes it very easy to other and go, well, my sons aren't young black men, I don't have to worry about that, and doesn't at all acknowledge what's happening. So I think, again, there's so many processes that obscure the reality and make it really hard for people to recognize actually maybe they do have a place that can fit in part of the prevention work. It's really hard. It does require quite an overhaul, I think, of how we think about and talk about and publicize things that happen.
And it's just going back to the first part of our conversation, the thought that victims, women, men, or others who not only are they carrying all that pain from what's happened to them, they're feeling ostracized by the community. And they must, that pain of the isolation, must just add to their sense of self-judgment and blame. It's just adds to the pain. It really does, doesn't it? It's horrible to imagine it. And how not to, even as we were talking about, how to get women to feel safer in the community, we start blaming men. This, good guy, bad guy is just everywhere, isn't it? We can't help but put people in boxes. And actually the putting people in boxes is part of the problem, that we want to simplify things, but it really is quite complex.
And it loses any sense of compassion, I think, is the problem. Compassion for victims, compassion for communities affected by it. As you said, compassion for the staff working in these services, even compassion for offenders. And that's something I really struggle with. As a therapist, I would not work with someone who had committed a sexual offense because I know they would not have the most empathic, non-judgmental therapist that they would deserve. But actually, that's a really important area of work because, again, statistics show reoffending rates are really high. So even when people are found guilty or sort of made accountable for a sexual offense, it doesn't work. Something's not happening because people go on to offend again. So if instead, as you say, of playing this blame game and shifting it around, we're able to somehow meet with an understanding, and it doesn't mean condoning what's happening, but actually some kind of ability and willingness to connect and see, particularly victims, that's my focus, as people who deserve respect and dignity and value and have whole complex lives and needs beyond the fact they're a victim. And I think this was another interesting finding that came out with the women I spoke to. They said, as soon as you talk to services, you're made to feel like you're just a victim. That's all you are. You're a status, you're a target, you're a case to be tried, you're a client to be pushed off a waiting list. They no longer felt like they were seen as people. And yet, if we're trying to help people rebuild their lives and their identity and their sense of self and their sense of safety after sexual violence, then that's so conflicting. Whereas if we're able to come with compassion and almost have that understanding, even if it's the compassion is, I cannot know what you've been through because it's so outside my frame of reference, but what can I do to help? What do you need? I'm here to listen. What can we do to make this slightly easier for you? I think that's where the key lies. And then everything kind of shifts because victims feel more able to report. They feel more able to get support and come forward earlier. And maybe if we're meeting staff members and colleagues with that same compassion, that makes a difference. That reduces burnout, reduces cynicism. And where I work in our student counselling service, we set up a trauma forum because we got to the point of having to acknowledge we're a student service. So we provide counselling to university students. And back in the day when these services were first set up, it was exam stress, homesickness, loneliness, the things you might expect that group to deal with. And now we're seeing so much child abuse, sexual violence, domestic violence, among other things. And we had to acknowledge we are becoming a trauma service. So we need to set up support services for us to make sure we don't get burnt out, that we don't experience vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue or all these things that are very real. And that's been really helpful because even just acknowledging, all of us have students we're working with who are talking about sexual violence. The impact of that is huge. Again, and it's been quite an insidious change. So I think we've not really noticed it. But again, that compassion, that supporting colleagues, that understanding, there isn't space for that in police services. There's very little space for that in the NHS, I think, as well. And if we can just expand those spaces and hold them, I do think it would make a difference. But that requires time, resources, people willing and able to do that and hold that space. And when funding and sources and everything is being stripped, that's the first thing to go, isn't it? That kind of self-care and that staff well-being approach, it's always the first to be cost cut, I think.
Yeah. It just reminds me of other conversations that we had. We had a conversation with my sister year ago now, almost, on moral injury, and you was talking about compassion fatigue, and it sort of ties into the moral injury as well, listening to sort of some of the stories of what happens in the police service and in trauma services where things don't go the way they really should. And when things don't go the way they should, that's a moral injury, and that we experience, those of us who care deeply about our work, when we see things that haven't been stopped or people haven't been supported the way they should, or, that's an incredible injury. And it often leads to disengagement because it's too hard. I guess listening to you, I'm thinking we often come to this place in our conversations where we recognize that, we're all, where compassion is so important, and how hard humans find it not to. Well, we find it quite hard to feel compassion for those who are suffering, because to feel compassion, you kind of have to feel the suffering too. To really sit with someone emotionally, really be there for them, you have to feel a bit of it too. And that's very difficult. It's very difficult. And it takes incredible courage to do that. And for something as painful to listen to as the story of a victim, we have to be kind and recognize that, not all of us can do that. That doesn't mean we then blame or we blame ourselves for not being able to do that. But to recognize that it is hard to listen to those stories, and it is hard to make space for somebody else's pain. But ultimately, wouldn't that be an incredible world where we could all be more compassionate? And that's what this is what we're in the service of, isn't it, Chris? Podcast, opening up our eyes to all the different things that we hide, and to recognize that, we're all really in the same soup. We all experience big feelings. We haven't always, had the same exact experiences, but we do struggle with dark corners of ourselves. We all have a mind.
Well, it is easy to fall into learned helplessness and despair and think, I can't change the patriarchy. I'm seeing the world going in the opposite direction of where we would like to see it go, when you have, presidential candidates who, have a history of sexual offending, and people, kind of write that off as good old boys will be boys kind of stuff. Professional athletes who are getting in trouble, but not very much trouble all the time for their violent behavior, off the field. But I think, just focusing on what can we do in this moment. I recall a study that was done years ago about physicians and their bedside manner, and they were looking at patient satisfaction in the hospital, and they were looking at what the physicians were doing in the room. And it wasn't how much time the physicians spent in the room, but the physicians that walked in, grabbed the chart at the foot of the bed and flipped through it, looking at the chart while they were like throwing questions at the person in the bed, not making any eye contact, and then left. They were not rated highly by the patients in terms of, satisfaction. But the physicians that came in, pulled up a chair, sat down next to the bed, looked at the person. They didn't spend any more time, but they were considered to be much more engaged and compassionate and helpful. So I think it is being able to hold that stuff, oh my God, I have to listen to this again. Oh my God, why can't we have, a shorter wait list, and hold that lightly, and to be able to be present and engaged and connect. I think that would go a long way while we're waiting for all this other systemic stuff to hopefully change at some point.
Absolutely. And that, as you described, that's about respect and value, isn't it? Seeing that patient as a person, and then getting to the nuts and bolts of what you've got to do in that moment. And that makes such a difference. And I would love to know how those doctors felt, the physicians, when they left, the ones that have that eye contact and make that effort. It's hard to imagine they wouldn't feel more like, I've just had a human connection, and feel a little boosted by that, versus the ones that went in and treated that patient like a machine that needed fixing. And I think this is what we see in trauma services, when you are able to really make that connection and it becomes a collective thing, because sexual violence is so often a very individual thing. We see it as something one person has done to another person, that person has to deal with it on their own. But once it starts becoming almost a community or a collective response, I think that it makes a difference, because the victim feels treated like a human, and then the burden is shared as well. I'm very lucky in my practice. My team are amazing. My manager's amazing. My clinical supervisor's brilliant. The number of times I've started a supervision session with, Debbie, you won't believe what's happened this week. And she's there for me and she will hear it. And I think that the problem is so much of this happens in isolation that, as you say, that compassion and that value is just lost. And then we feel burnt out and useless and unsatisfied in our work.
Any final thought?
Yes.
There is hope. I think that's the thing I really, from the research, and I'm looking at writing it up in different ways now, that so many of the women I spoke to mentioned things that really made a difference. And, not just in terms of the waiting lists, but having to sit down and have a really difficult conversation, but being offered a cup of tea and a biscuit. Like, that's a small thing, but it just says, I'm aware you might have some additional needs. You're hungry, you're thirsty, you need the sugar, you need the caffeine. Like, those things do make such a difference. And these are not expensive, big changes that services need to make. It's just really prioritizing the time to figure out what those changes are. And that's something I'm hoping to do in my consultancy, is actually create energy and space where that can happen. But it is hopeful and it is achievable, as you say, Chris, while we're waiting for all the bigger stuff to get dismantled and rebuilt or whatever's going to happen.
I was also thinking, in addition to the services, as individuals, what is your hope for us as humans to be able to, the fact that we're having this conversation makes it hopeful. The fact that we're talking about victim blame, because it is an incredibly uncomfortable thought that victims do feel blamed, makes me feel hopeful. Like we're looking at the things that are dark and that we don't like. What thoughts do you have for us, the rest of us that live in this world and can be judgmental or find ourselves wanting to push away from somebody who has experienced something horrible?
The very nihilistic bit of me, the bit that loves horror films, is very waiting. I'm engaged with the apocalypse and the annihilation of the human race. I'm waiting for that to happen. I'm excited about it. But the bit of me that actually lives in the real world, I think, again, it's about compassion. I think that the great thing about having these conversations is it's getting called out. And the example I think of, we had a very high profile murder in the UK of a young woman, Sarah Everard, who was murdered by a serving police officer. And a police and a crime commissioner in an area, I don't think it was where she was murdered, but he tweeted something that came across as very victim blaming about women should know when a police officer is trying to conduct a legitimate arrest and when they're trying to use their credentials. Anyway, it was a horrible thing. But the rate and the speed at which he was called out, and people on social media, on the news, were saying that is victim blaming and that's not acceptable. And he had to backtrack and apologize. And I think eventually he had to step down because it realized, as someone in that position, it wasn't tenable for him to not get it. So that I found that really hopeful, even though it was awful and did not need to be said. The volume of challenge was amazing. And it showed that actually it is being recognized and called out. And on an individual level, I think it's individually as well, meeting ourselves with that compassion and recognizing we all have biases, we all have attitudes we hold and assumptions that are not rooted in reality and might be prejudicial in some way. And if people are interested and they go and they read up on rape myths, there's a lot of information out there that can challenge and help us recognize, oh, that isn't actually the reality of sexual violence. Okay. So that might help you feel more informed, but also being gentle with yourself and saying, look, if a loved one, a friend, a family member discloses something like that, it is horrible. And you're going to have an emotional reaction because you're human. And if you didn't, I don't know what that would say about you, but it's a horrible thing to contend with. And that emotional reaction is going to come with a lot of noise and a lot of assumptions, because your initial reaction is going to be, this feels uncomfortable, I want to make it okay. And sometimes that's where blaming comes from. We just want to rectify this dissonance. And that's okay, because if we recognize that and we take a breath and we're kind on ourselves, I think either we can apologize for things we do or say, or we can take that breath before we've said them and go, okay, my brain is telling me to ask her how much she'd had to drink, or why she went there on her own, or why she went home with him, or whatever. But what I'm going to do is just not say that. And I'm going to be with her in the moment and say something supportive, or ask her if she wants to talk, or, whatever we would do normally to be that caring, empathic person. But I think to then come back to ourselves with that compassion, we've kind of been socialized to think this way. It is ingrained. It's hard work to challenge that and to think differently. And we're all works in progress. I'm still catching myself. Even though I've been immersed in this sort of literature for years and years, I'm catching myself on, oh, that's interesting. That definitely resonates with me as something I felt or I thought. So again, it comes back to compassion, I think, as you said.
So shall we put your website in the show notes for this episode if people want to get a hold of you or regarding training or your consultancy work around creating these safe spaces?
That'd be great. I have a few bits of research briefings and some articles on there as well if people are interested. But yeah, please do.
Well, you can send that to us and we'll include those references in the show notes and we will spread the word.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Amy Beddows. This has been very profound and provocative and important.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Definitely profound and quite bold. Let's be honest. It's bold and important.
Well, thank you both for inviting me and being willing to make space for this topic because it's not usually people's go-to topic to listen about, actually. So I appreciate it being given airtime because, as you can tell, I think it's quite important. So thank you.
Thanks so much for tuning into the Life's Dirty Little Secrets podcast.
If you have any feedback for us or secrets for future episodes, you can email us at lifesdirtylittlesecretspodcast@gmail.com.
Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Life's Dirty Little Secrets or on Facebook at Life's Dirty Little Secrets Podcast.
We invite you to follow, rate, and review us on wherever you listen to this podcast. It is the best way to get our podcast out in front of new listeners.
We'll be back in a couple of weeks with more.
See you then.